$44 million. The value of the cocaine at the Monos Islands obviously would have been within that vicinity, almost 700 million. This amount of money is obviously coming through the system, passing through the system. Alan Stanford was trying to take his money through in Antigua, and it was picked up. Why are we not picking this up?
Right.
And there's evidence to say that the drugs are leaving, the guns are staying, the money must be going somewhere.
Right. So it raises questions about how effective our systems are. That there are legislative systems is not in doubt. The FIU has been doing that. Regulatory processes have been put in. Lawyers, real estate agents, all the persons who theoretically would come in contact with large amounts of money in transactions, which may be in a position, people who deal with casinos, are all now required to make declarations to report suspicious transactions. So the first thing is the authorities are there. The question of whether they're well financed, the question of whether they have the adequate training to do what they have to do, are all issues up in the air. I suppose those answers will really be made clear when we start seeing prosecutions and we start seeing. We know there's a lot of activity because there are reports that there are all these transactions that have been investigated. It appears that everything is being investigated, but nothing
is coming out of it.
Is coming out that is worthy of prosecution. And that's interesting because I remember doing a presentation once to a group of police officers on the question of money laundering. And I used the American example, and in Los Angeles and California, I was able to show in a 4-year period the sheer amount of litigation and persons at all walks of life being charged for money laundering. And money laundering is really, you know that money is obtained from crime and you try to conceal it, or you try to disguise it, or you try to take it out of the country, or you try to... And it's clear that it's happening in Trinidad.
It is quite clear.
But the problem is, are we getting the evidence? And that raises questions about the ability of the institutions to take the legislative framework that is put in and implement it in a manner. Now, I simply don't know why it's not happening. You have to ask those people who will be in the best position. But one expects that if structures are being put in place, we're going to see some results.
Because, you know, I was speaking to you off air about a story that I'm working on, and we do have confiscation orders. You do have, the government has the ability, even without the FIU, under the Proceeds of Crime Act, the confiscation orders can be made. So if you suspect that person A, B, or C, you have any reason, because it's quite draconian, the legislation, you can basically go in and freeze people's assets.
There was a time in Trinidad, just after the 1991 Dangerous Drugs Act, particularly around 1995 to around 2001, 2002, where persons charged with significant amounts of drugs and persons charged with not so significant amount of drugs found themselves under confiscation. Well, let me start, restraint orders. So I remember one person in Rio Claro who was charged with not a significant amount of drugs for trafficking, and because the police felt that the person's house and other property had been derived from drug trafficking, a restraint order was placed on the person's assets, and essentially the person, until he won his case in court 10 years after, essentially could not use his money unless it was that. That's not to suggest. There have been other cases in Trinidad where persons, they have had successful confiscations, where after they have convicted the persons, the monies have been seized and confiscated by the state because it was presumed and proven that these were the proceeds of crime. The simple point is this: at that particular point in
that is when
time,
Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj declared a war on drugs, and you saw that there was this slew of legislation that came into place, including the Dangerous Drugs Act and this Proceeds of Crime. There was a number of pieces of legislation which allowed the authorities to go in and say, this business, I have reason to believe. You don't even have to have the paper. You have a suspicion that this business may be supported by illegal activities, and you can freeze it.
It's a little more than that, Hema, because in each of the cases where there were restraint orders, they had actually charged the person with drugs and therefore restrained the assets for the trial to take place. Whether there's a declaration of war and whether there's legislation, those things don't usually mean much to me. What is more important is a question of whether you put the systems in place. And from my own mind, there was a unit in the police service at that time, because whenever I had to go to court and deal with the restraint orders, there were affidavits filed by the same police officers. They were all part of a particular unit, and they were doing sterling work. They were putting things in place. That once persons were arrested, confiscation applications, restraint applications were all put in, and it worked for a number of years. For some reason, all of the unit, I don't know what happened to it, but people continued to be charged with trafficking in this country, but suddenly nobody was making applications for restraint orders. Nobody was doing that anymore.
Why do you think? Because the logical connection that with the drugs there must be a flow of money, and if you want to effectively deal with the drug trade, you have to deal, or the authorities must stop the flow of financing.
It's not rocket science. Everywhere in the world, that is what is accepted. You have to put system, drugs, proceeds of crime, financial implications. You need to deal with that. That's why we have all this legislation. That's why the government of Trinidad and Tobago has to come on board with international standards. You remember there was talk about blacklisting us if we didn't.
We were in the gray area.
We were in the gray
shades
area.
Of gray.
But
hopefully not 50 shades.
But the point remains that it's really up to us to put in the legislation. But is it that all we're going to do is put in the legislation and then nothing else happens? Because if we all accept you need to put the systems in place, but it's one thing to put the system, you must fund it, you must ensure that the people are well trained, and you must be brave enough to go out and start testing the waters.
Now, if it is that the FIU has been in existence and their only claim to fame is someone attempting to defraud on tickets to a cruise ship, when are we really going to test the effectiveness of these units? If the legislation is in place, if the Dangerous Drugs Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act allows the authorities the power to go in and basically restrain the assets, stop the flow of money to this particular entity until the investigations are complete, then what is the test to determine if any of these systems are working now? Because they obviously worked a couple of years ago, 10 years ago. You saw the courts were filled. You look at the court records, confiscation orders were in place, people were going in, the flow of money there were attempts to stop the flow of money.
Well, to be fair, it's a question that needs to be addressed to the persons who actually can answer that. To the extent that anybody who's responsible for putting systems in place and implementing those systems has also a responsibility to assist as to why things may or may not be working, or why things are not reaching to the standard. There may be very good reasons. I'm not in a position to criticize anybody, but I do think it's worthy of asking questions. And it's not something that's confined to the FIU. I think every institution in this country, is under obligation to explain why is it not meeting proper standards, and if there are reasons why it's not meeting proper standards, explain, because we're not going to know how to improve it unless somebody opens their mouth and says something.
Let's talk about the legislation and the avenues available to the government if they do want to effectively deal with this.
Yes.
What's in place right now that they can say, I can use this and go after the drug dealers or the money launderers?
Well, there is, in my view, sufficient legislation in place. There's the FIU structure, which is, from what I have seen in the last few months, being enforced to the extent that they are requiring people to register and therefore give information. If someone comes into a lawyer's office now, the lawyer has an obligation to make inquiries. If someone's going to pass significant amount of money, you have to figure out where the source of funds come. And so mechanisms are now in place to ask questions with relevant persons to ensure that the monies may not be from the proceeds of crime. If something is suspicious, there's a duty to report it. So one can only assume that once this information is getting there, persons with the appropriate level of intelligence will do the information gathering and determine whether something is suspect. And I'm seeing that working. I'm seeing information. I'm also seeing FIU enforcing and forcing people to do compliance manuals, etc. That's the first stage. The question is, what is coming out of that information? Is it prosecutable, if I could put it that way?
Because I think there was a report from 2012 to 2010 in terms of the quantity of money and suspicious transactions flagged. 600 million or billion, I believe, was the amount. And out of that, nothing. So if you have flagged $600 billion worth of suspicious activity in the system.
Suspicious doesn't necessarily mean illegal, but you would accept and I accept your suggestion that if there's so many suspicious transactions, one would have thought at least one. And so it's a question of, what is the problem? Is the problem that there's a lack of evidence? What is the difficulty? And I think we really do need to find out, because we have had, with less complex systems of legislation, successful prosecutions under the Dangerous Drugs Act. We've had confiscations made. Long before the FIU legislation came in, there have been people with sufficient competence and levels to put together cases and restrain and confiscate people's assets. So it's a very interesting question. And as I say, only certain people will be able to answer that, and it depends on what answer they're going to give. But the legislative infrastructure is there. I suspect it's probably training and resources.
Training
tends to be the problem throughout most of the things.
So then we just have to have sufficient KPIs and make the tough decisions to determine whether this is working or not.
Perhaps.
Making the tough decisions. Can the authorities do that? Rajiv Prasad, well-known attorney in Trinidad and Tobago, talking about what's in place, the avenues available for the government, should they choose to go after the criminal elements or the financiers of the drug trade in Trinidad and Tobago. At this time, we're going to check in with Akash Samru for the 7 o'clock news update. And when we come back, the Thoracic Society. How dangerous is the smoke emanating from the bee thumb? So we're now checking with Akash Samru. Stay with us.